The fine notices had reached 41 consecutive days by the time I finally understood exactly what I was dealing with, each one identical $75 a day for an unauthorized decorative alteration to my pool's interior surface. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table with all 41 of them spread out in front of me, doing the math on what this woman was trying to bleed out of me over a mosaic of a monarch butterfly. The same butterfly my son Julian used to chase through our backyard every single summer before the leukemia took him at age 9, 3 years before any of this happened. My name is Farida Osei Callahan. My husband Desmond and I live in Thornbury Glen, a community of about 240 homes, and about a year after we lost Julian, once we felt like we could face the pool again without it simply being a place of unbearable absence, we made the decision to have a small mosaic installed on the pool's floor, near the shallow end, a monarch butterfly rendered in glass tile, the exact species Julian had loved so specifically that his hospital room, during his final months, had been decorated entirely with butterfly drawings he'd made himself. I want to establish, clearly and immediately, that we did not simply install this without any regard for our community's process. We submitted a formal architectural modification request to our HOA board 8 months before installation, including detailed renderings of the mosaic design, its exact placement, and specifications from the pool contractor confirming the installation method met all relevant safety and structural standards. That request was approved, in writing, by the board under its president at the time, a kind, soft-spoken man named Bartholomew Echterberg, who personally called me after the approval to say that he was glad the board could support something that clearly meant so much to our family. Bartholomew stepped down about 5 months after our mosaic was installed, following a health issue in his family that required him to relocate, and the board elected, through an uncontested vote, a woman named Priscilla Vandermeer Holt to take his place. I want to walk you through exactly how Priscilla's tenure unfolded from the very beginning, because the pattern that led to what eventually happened to our memorial mosaic did not emerge in isolation, and understanding it matters for everything that follows. Priscilla's first several months in office were defined by what several of my neighbors described to me, independently, as an unusually aggressive re-review of previously approved architectural modifications throughout the community, disputes over already approved fence stains, already approved shed placements. Decisions that had been settled under Bartholomew's board suddenly reopened under Priscilla's insistence that prior enforcement had been inconsistent and needed to be brought into uniform compliance with what she described as a stricter reading of our governing declaration's aesthetic standards. I received a letter from Priscilla about 7 months into her term, informing me that our pool's mosaic, despite its prior written approval, would need to undergo a supplemental compliance review due to what she described as concerns that a figurative decorative element on a pool's interior surface exceeded what our declaration's aesthetic guidelines permitted for what she characterized as an amenity structure visible to neighboring properties. I want to tell you about the phone call I had with Priscilla shortly after receiving that letter, because I think it reveals something important about how this entire situation unfolded. I explained to her, as calmly as I could manage given what this mosaic actually represented to our family, exactly what it was, a memorial to our son, installed with full prior board approval, and asked her directly what specific compliance concern had prompted this review nearly a year and a half after the mosaic had already been in place without a single complaint. Her response, delivered with a brisk, procedural coldness that I found genuinely difficult to sit through, was that the board's current interpretation of the aesthetic standards clause did not distinguish between the emotional significance of a decorative element and its technical compliance with community guidelines, and that I would need to submit updated documentation for the review to proceed, with the mosaic remaining under advisement in the meantime. I complied, submitting the same documentation that had been approved 18 months earlier, along with a letter explaining, in detail, the mosaic's significance as a memorial to Julian, hopping that context even if legally unnecessary given the prior approval, might soften what felt like an unnecessarily clinical review process. Priscilla's response, delivered about 3 weeks later, denied the continued approval outright, citing, for the first time, a specific provision in our declaration prohibiting non-standard decorative surfaces on structural components visible from adjoining properties, and gave us 30 days to remove or resurface the mosaic or face, escalating daily fines. I want to be honest about the particular quality of grief and anger that decision produced in me, because I think it matters for understanding everything that followed. This was not simply an aesthetic dispute over a fence color or a mailbox style. This was a woman with full knowledge of exactly what the mosaic represented, having received my own written explanation of Julian's story, deciding that a butterfly memorializing a 9-year-old who died of cancer constituted a compliance violation serious enough to warrant daily monetary punishment. Desmond and I appealed the decision formally, requesting a meeting with the full board rather than continuing to correspond only with Priscilla directly, a meeting that was scheduled, then rescheduled twice, before finally taking place nearly 6 weeks after the original denial, during which time the daily fines had already begun accumulating, $75 a day, a number that, by the time of that meeting, had already exceeded $3,000. At that meeting, held in the clubhouse with 3 other board members present alongside Priscilla, I brought a printed copy of the original approval documentation from Bartholomew's board, Julian's hospital drawings scanned and printed to show the exact source of the mosaic's design, and a formal letter from our family's grief counselor explaining, in professional terms, the significance of memorial elements in processing childhood loss. I watched throughout that presentation as 2 of the 3 other board members appeared visibly moved and uncomfortable with the direction this had taken, while Priscilla maintained the same clinical, procedural posture she'd held throughout our correspondence, reiterating that the board's obligation was to apply community standards consistently, regardless of the emotional context behind any individual request. It was one of the other board members, a quieter woman named Rosalind Ake Ferreira, who asked the question during that meeting that ended up mattering more than anything else said that evening. She turned to Priscilla and asked, simply, "Has this exact kind of decorative element ever been approved for any other property in this community, under your tenure or otherwise?" Priscilla's answer, delivered without any apparent hesitation, was that she was not aware of any comparable approved installations, a statement that, I would discover within the following 2 weeks, was not simply mistaken. It was, based on everything my neighbor Adiz Nwasuwitfield would soon help me uncover, something considerably closer to an outright lie, because the exact same monarch butterfly mosaic design, down to the specific glass tile pattern and coloring, existed in a backyard pool less than half a mile from my own, installed, approved, and personally commissioned by Priscilla Vandermeer Holt herself. Adiz Nwasuwitfield lives 3 streets over from me. And I want to explain how she came to be the person who uncovered this, because it happened almost by accident, the way so many of these discoveries seem to. Adiz's daughter had attended the same summer art camp as Priscilla's niece 2 years earlier, and during a conversation about the camp's various projects, Adiz mentioned, in passing, my ongoing dispute over the mosaic fine, describing the design specifically, a monarch butterfly in glass tile. Priscilla's niece, according to what Adiz later relayed to me, had responded with genuine confusion, saying something like, "Wait, that's the same butterfly Aunt Priscilla has in her pool." Adiz called me that same evening, and I remember the specific disbelief in her voice as she relayed the conversation, because neither of us wanted to assume too much from an offhand comment made by a teenager who might easily have been mistaken about the exact design. But the possibility was enough that I decided, along with Desmond, to actually verify it, and what we found, once we did some careful, entirely legal research, confirmed it beyond any reasonable doubt. Our county's property records included, as part of a home value assessment appeal Priscilla had filed about 2 years earlier, a set of photographs submitted to support her case for a reduced valuation following what she described in the filing as storm damage to her pool deck. Those photographs, filed as part of a public record, included clear images of her own backyard pool, and there, rendered in the exact same glass tile pattern, the exact same wing coloring, the exact same size and placement near the shallow end, was the identical monarch butterfly mosaic she had just spent 6 weeks denying any knowledge of a comparable installation for. I want to tell you about the specific moment I saw those photographs clearly enough to be certain, because it was one of the more surreal experiences of this entire ordeal, sitting in my own kitchen, printouts from a public county filing spread across the same table where, weeks earlier, I had spread out 41 consecutive daily fine notices, staring at an image of the exact butterfly Julian used to chase through our yard. Installed in the private pool of the very woman who had spent months insisting our version of it violated community aesthetic standards. I brought this discovery to Farrokh Delacroix Boyd, a property attorney a friend had recommended, once this dispute had escalated well beyond what felt manageable through the HOA's own internal process alone. Farrokh reviewed the county filing photographs alongside our own approval documentation and the fine notices, and told us, within our very first meeting, that this was, in his professional assessment, one of the more clear-cut cases of selective, discriminatory enforcement he'd encountered in years of HOA litigation. "This isn't a close call," he said. "She's not just enforcing a rule inconsistently by accident. She has the exact same decorative element in her own home, and when directly asked in an official board meeting whether any comparable installation existed, she stated under what amounts to a formal governance proceeding that she wasn't aware of one. That's not an oversight. That's a false statement made specifically to support an enforcement action she knew, personally and directly, was being applied unequally." Farrokh filed a formal legal challenge on our behalf, incorporating both a demand that the fines be immediately rescinded and refunded given the demonstrated selective enforcement, and a separate complaint to the full HOA board detailing Priscilla's apparent misrepresentation during the appeal meeting, supported by the county filing photographs as documentary evidence. I want to walk you through what happened once this reached the full board, because it moved considerably faster than either of us expected once the documentation was laid out plainly. Rosalind, the board member who had originally asked the pointed question during our appeal meeting, was, according to what I later learned from a mutual acquaintance, the person who pushed hardest internally for an immediate emergency session once she saw the county filing photographs, reportedly telling the other board members that she felt personally embarrassed to have sat through Priscilla's flat denial during that earlier meeting without realizing, at the time, exactly how untrue it apparently was. The emergency board meeting was held about 2 weeks after Farrokh's complaint was filed, and I want to tell you, walking into that clubhouse with the county filing photographs printed and enlarged, sitting beside Desmond with Julian's hospital drawings once again in hand, felt different this time, because I understood, walking in, that we were no longer simply making an emotional appeal for compassion. We were presenting hard, documented proof of exactly the kind of hypocrisy that no amount of procedural language was going to explain away. Priscilla, given the opportunity to respond once the photographs were presented, attempted initially to argue that her own installation had been completed years earlier, before her tenure on the board, and therefore existed under a different regulatory context, an explanation that Farrokh, present at the meeting as our counsel, dismantled almost immediately by pointing out that the actual declaration language she had cited against us contained no such grandfather clause, and that if her own installation had, by her own admission, never gone through any formal architectural review process at all, that fact alone demonstrated the review she'd invoked against our mosaic was being applied in a manner she herself had never been subject to. A woman near the back of the room, someone I recognized as a longtime resident who had known Bartholomew well during his tenure, asked the question that I think finally ended any remaining defense Priscilla had. "You told us at the last meeting you weren't aware of any comparable installation," she said. "Was that true or not?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that I remember counting it, nearly 10 full seconds, before Priscilla finally said, quietly, that she hadn't considered her own pool relevant to the question at the time. An answer that satisfied absolutely nobody in that room, least of all Rosalind, who I watched visibly shake her head from her seat at the board table. The vote that followed was immediate and unanimous, minus Priscilla's own abstention, to rescind every fine in full, refund the entire accumulated amount, which by that point had climbed past $4,000, and formally reinstate the Mosaic's approval permanently, with an explicit written note in the community record establishing that no future review of this specific installation would ever be permitted absent a genuine structural safety concern documented by a licensed inspector, closing off any possibility of this happening again under some future board president with similar instincts. Priscilla resigned from the board within the month, and I want to tell you honestly, unlike some of the more dramatic resolutions I've heard about from friends who have dealt with similarly overreaching HOA presidents, this one didn't end with a courtroom or a criminal referral or a public spectacle on the evening news. It ended mostly with a quiet, uncomfortable board meeting, a refund check, and a woman who, as far as I know, still lives in the same house 3 streets from Adiz, with the exact same butterfly mosaic still sitting in her own pool, though I understand from a mutual acquaintance that she's rarely mentioned within the neighborhood anymore without someone eventually bringing up what happened. I want to tell you about the day the refund check arrived, because it wasn't really about the money, not in any way that mattered to me personally. Desmond and I used a portion of it to commission a second, smaller mosaic near the first, a small cluster of the specific wildflowers Julian used to pick for me every summer, a project we'd talked about doing eventually, but had never quite found the emotional bandwidth to pursue until this entire ordeal, strangely, gave us a kind of resolve we hadn't expected to find in the middle of a fine dispute. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Farrokh said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing the county filing photographs for what must have been the 5th time. He said that people who weaponize community standards against something deeply personal, a memorial, a tribute, a piece of someone's grief made visible, often do so because they've convinced themselves that procedural language provides a kind of moral cover, that citing a rule, however selectively applied, absolves them of having to reckon with what they're actually doing to another person. The moment you can prove, plainly and undeniably, that the rule was never actually a rule at all, just a convenient tool applied to some people and not others, the cover disappears completely, and what's left is simply the truth of what someone chose to do to a grieving family, for reasons that, in the end, made no sense at all beyond an unwillingness to admit she'd been wrong. We proved it, and it turns out that one offhand comment from a teenager at a summer art camp, one public county filing nobody thought to check, and one identical monarch butterfly sitting quietly in Priscilla Vandermeerholt's own backyard were more than enough to make sure Julian's memorial stayed exactly where it belonged, in the pool where he used to swim, chasing the very insect he loved most, undisturbed for good. Thumbnail text. She had the same mosaic in her pool.